She set his ring on the morning-room desk beside her open ledger. He stood in the doorway, watching her fingers leave the ring and reach. But Eleanor did not look up. She turned a page of the ledger instead. Because what the Marquess of Dunmore did not yet know could fill that. She came to give it back. She left with something far more valuable than his ring. Eleanor Ashford turned the page of the brass-cornered ledger and dipped her pen into the inkwell without looking, the way a woman does when she has performed the same motion 4,000 times and no longer needs her eyes to find the glass rim. The morning room at Ashford Hall smelled of tallow and cold tea, and the particular staleness of a fire that had been banked too early by a maid who assumed no one would be working at 6:30. Someone was always working at 6:30. It had been Eleanor for 4 years running, ever since her father dropped dead over his breakfast chocolate and left behind an earldom worth less than the debts pinned to it. The ledger, dark brown leather, worn soft at the spine, brass corners tarnished to the colour of old honey, lay open to a page dense with her handwriting. Columns of figures ran in 2 directions. Grain prices negotiated with Harwell and Sons at £2 4 per quarter, which was 4p under the Norwich rate, and had taken her 3 letters and a veiled threat about the Ipswich competitor to secure. Rents collected from 9 tenant farms, totalling £412 for the Michaelmas term. A note in the margin, underlined twice, about the drainage ditch on the South Meadow that Mr. Pruitt had flagged in September, and no one had funded because there was nothing left to fund it with. The estate ran on £1,100 per annum, and Eleanor kept it solvent the way a woman keeps a cracked pitcher from leaking, by never once setting it down. Her fingers were stained with ink. They were always stained with ink. The cameo brooch at her collar caught the thin October light as she leaned forward, and a loose strand of dark chestnut hair slipped from the braided knot at her nape and brushed her cheekbone. She did not push it back. She was counting. Geoffrey, the Earl of Ashford, her brother, 20 years old, hazel-eyed, dimpled, and utterly useless in the most cheerful way imaginable, was 3 days into a shooting trip in the Scottish Highlands. Unreachable by post, unreachable by conscience. He had left with a silver hip flask in his coat pocket and a vague promise to return by Thursday, which Thursday he had not specified, and Eleanor had not asked, because she had learned by his 2nd year as Earl that asking Geoffrey for specificity was like asking rain to fall upward. It was not that he was cruel. It was not even that he was stupid. He was simply a young man who had never been required to be anything other than pleasant, and pleasantness, Eleanor had discovered, was the most expensive quality a person could possess. It cost everyone around him everything, and cost him nothing at all. Mr. Pruitt knew this. The old steward, silver-haired, stooped at the shoulders, his brass ring of estate keys clinking softly at his belt, had served Ashford Hall for 30 years and had watched 3 generations of Ashfords mismanage it with varying degrees of flair. He had told Eleanor once, in the quiet of the estate office, that she had the sharpest mind he'd encountered in 4 decades of service. He had said it the way one reports the weather. A fact, not a compliment. Eleanor had nodded and asked him about the South Meadow drainage, and that had been the end of it. Into this silence, on a Tuesday morning in October, arrived Adrian Hale, Marquess of Dunmore. His carriage pulled into the gravel sweep at 10:15. a well-sprung barouche drawn by a matched pair of bays, the Dunmore crest on the door in faded gilt. He stepped out tall, 6'1", broad-shouldered and lean, in a dark blue coat over a buff waistcoat. His dark gold hair swept back from his forehead and just catching the collar. The small brass pocket compass in his waistcoat pocket caught the light as he adjusted his cravat. A man worth £11,000 a year does not rush. He does not need to. The world has been arriving on time for him since birth. He had come for a canal partnership meeting with the Earl. Projected investment? £40,000 for a navigation cut linking the River Deben to the wool markets at Stowmarket. He expected Geoffrey. He expected ledgers prepared by a steward. He expected, in the particular way of men who have never been surprised by a drawing room, that the business would be simple. Eleanor met him in the morning room. She had the ledger open to the canal pages. She presented her revised terms without preamble. Projected tonnage at 14,000 tonnes per annum. Maintenance cost schedules at £600 per mile. The drainage survey she had commissioned herself from a civil engineer in Bury St Edmunds for the cost of 8 guineas, which she had paid from the household butter money because there was no other fund that could absorb it. Adrian listened. He watched her ink-stained fingers trace the columns. He glanced at the brass-cornered ledger, at her neat hand, at the figures that were, by any honest measure, meticulous. Then he smiled, genuinely, warmly, the way a man smiles at a child who has built an impressive tower of blocks, and told her he would wait for her brother to discuss the actual figures. He called her work charmingly thorough. He said it the way you'd compliment a watercolour painted by someone's niece. Not the foundation, he said, still smiling, that easy blue gaze, steady and unthreatened, for a £40,000 canal investment. Charmingly thorough. 2 words. No malice in them at all. That was what made them land like a blade between the ribs. Eleanor closed the ledger. The brass corners clicked shut, a small, precise sound, like a door locking. She thanked him. She instructed the housekeeper to prepare the east wing for his stay. Her voice did not waver. Her grey-green eyes did not blink. The faint, crescent-shaped birthmark below her right ear was the only part of her that flushed, and he did not notice it, because he had already stopped looking. That evening, Adrian retired to the east wing, and Eleanor sat alone in the morning room, dipped her pen, and wrote a single question to her solicitor in London: whether the canal easement rights crossing Ashford land could be legally revoked without the Earl's signature. Geoffrey extended his shooting trip by another week, then another, and Adrian Hale found himself stranded at Ashford Hall with nothing to do but wait, and, increasingly, to notice. It started with small things. A tenant named Hargrove appeared at the kitchen door on Tuesday morning, cap in hand, asking not for the Earl, but for Lady Eleanor. He carried a list of seed orders: 12 bushels of winter wheat, 8 of barley, 4 of turnip seed at 3 shillings 6pence the pound. And Eleanor reviewed it against something in that brass-cornered ledger of hers, corrected a figure without looking up, and sent him away satisfied in under 4 minutes. Adrian watched from the library window, his brass compass turning slowly between his fingers, and thought nothing of it. A woman playing house. Charming, really. Then came the drainage complaint. 2 men from the East Tenancy arrived Thursday afternoon, mud to their knees, furious about a blocked culvert that had flooded 6 acres of good pasture. Eleanor met them in the front hall, still wearing her dove-grey muslin, the cream fichu tucked precisely into her bodice, and listened without interrupting for 11 minutes. She asked 3 questions. She referenced a survey from 1808. She authorised the repair at a cost of £7 and directed them to Mr. Pruitt for the labour, and both men left looking, if Adrian was honest about it, relieved. Not grateful the way tenants are grateful to a lord, relieved the way men are relieved when a competent person takes charge of a situation that has been mismanaged. Friday brought the disputed fence line at the south boundary, £14 worth of timber, a neighbour named Croft who'd moved his posts 8 feet onto Ashford land, and a property map Eleanor produced from the morning room desk without hesitation. She'd already written to Croft's solicitor. The letter, Adrian noticed as she folded it, cited the relevant statute by number. He told himself he was merely observing. Passing time. A man stuck in someone else's house must look at something. Then Mr. Pruitt made his move. The old steward was subtle about it. Adrian would grant him that. The estate books simply appeared on the library table one afternoon, left open as if someone had been reviewing them and stepped away. The brass ring of keys at Pruitt's belt had clinked past the door not 2 minutes before, and the timing was, let us say, conspicuous. Pruitt's pale blue eyes, watery but knife-sharp beneath those ridiculous upward-curling eyebrows, had lingered on Adrian's face at breakfast that morning, with an expression that could only be described as strategic. Adrian read the books. He meant to skim them. He did not skim them. Eleanor had restructured the home farm's crop rotation 2 years prior, shifted the 4-field system to a modified 5-course that introduced clover as a restorative, reduced fallow acreage by a 5th, and increased overall yield by a 3rd. The numbers were meticulous. Every column balanced to the penny. Every projection annotated with a source. Tull, Young, her own trials on the North 40. The handwriting was small, exact, and ruthlessly legible, and the margins contained calculations so inventive that Adrian sat back in his chair and stared at the ceiling for a full 30 seconds before he could bring himself to turn the page. He turned the page. The following week brought Mr. Aldis, the local banker, a stout man with ink-stained cuffs who called at Ashford Hall on a matter of quarterly rents. Adrian happened to be in the front hall. Happened, he would insist, though he had been pacing there for 20 minutes, and made some remark about the estate's management during Geoffrey's frequent absences. Aldis looked at him the way one looks at a man who has just asked whether the sun rises in the east. "Lady Eleanor is the best head for figures between here and Manchester," he said, flatly, as though stating the price of bread. "Has been since she took the books from old Pruitt. What, 18 months ago? We don't worry about Ashford accounts, my lord. Not any more." Adrian's left eyebrow, the one that sat a fraction higher than the right, climbed another fraction. Aldis did not notice. Aldis was already heading toward the morning room, where Eleanor waited with the ledger open and a fresh pot of ink. That was the first real crack. Not a revelation. Adrian Hale was not a man built for revelations, but a fissure, a hairline fracture in the comfortable architecture of his assumptions, the kind that lets in a draft you can't quite locate but can't stop feeling. The ledger reappeared 3 days later. It sat on the morning room desk, open to a page Adrian recognized, the canal projections he had dismissed at dinner that first evening, the ones Eleanor had cited while he smiled his tolerant, insufferable smile. He read the figures properly this time. Her estimates for construction cost per mile came in at £4,200 against his own projections of £4,800. She had accounted for limestone availability from local quarries he hadn't known existed. Her revenue model assumed lower tolls but higher volume, and the arithmetic, damn the arithmetic, was better than his own. He closed the ledger, opened it again, closed it. The brass corners caught the morning light, and he set it down very carefully, as though it might detonate. 4 days after that, the letter arrived. It came addressed to Lady Eleanor Ashford, from a London solicitor she did not recognise, a Mr. Fenton of Fenton, Coyle and Marsh, representing certain creditors of the Marquess of Dunmore. She read it at her writing desk, the grey-green eyes moving once across the page, then back to the beginning, then across again. The canal urgency was not business enthusiasm. Dunmore was leveraged against the canal's completion. 2 properties pledged as security against debts totalling £11,000. If the project stalled, if the easement rights were denied, creditors would call those debts. Adrian Hale had been negotiating from weakness while performing strength, and every confident sentence he'd spoken at her table had been a man standing on a trapdoor, pretending he was on solid ground. Eleanor read the letter twice. She folded it along its original creases. She filed it, without a word, in the brass-cornered workbox beside her ledger, the ledger now carrying its second meaning. Not just her record of the estate, but her record of him. Their arguments began over dinners neither could politely escape. The long table set for 2, candles guttering in the draught from the hall, and no subject safe enough to prevent them from finding something to disagree about. The first evening, Adrian brought canal toll projections he had obtained from a surveyor in Birmingham. A man, he noted, of considerable reputation. Eleanor set down her fork, picked up the sheet, and told him his surveyor had miscalculated the per-ton rate by a factor that would cost the estate roughly £1,100 over the first 3 years of operation. Adrian smiled the smile of a man who has been told something absurd by someone who does not understand the subject. He said, with the unhurried patience one might extend to a shopkeeper disputing a bill, that the figures had been reviewed by 2 separate engineers. Eleanor said that was unfortunate for the engineers. Then she turned the page sideways, pointed to the column where tonnage had been multiplied against a rate of 4 shillings 8pence rather than the contracted 3 shillings 9pence, and asked him whether his men of considerable reputation could subtract. Mr. Pruitt, seated at the far end of the table, with a glass of claret he had been nursing for 40 minutes, developed a sudden cough. Adrian rechecked the column. She was right. He rechecked the second column she had not yet mentioned. She was right about that one too, though she had the grace, or perhaps the strategy, not to say so until he found it himself. That was the first evening. By the third, he had stopped smiling the smile. By the 5th, he was bringing his own estate papers to the table. Not the canal scheme, but the working accounts of Dunmore Park itself, the drainage surveys and the timber contracts and the quarterly rents from 14 tenant farms spread across 2 counties. He did not ask for her opinion. He simply laid them beside the salt cellar and waited. And here was the thing Eleanor noticed, the thing she turned over in her mind late at night, with the brass-cornered ledger open on her lap and a single tallow candle burning down to its dish. He listened. When she corrected him, and she corrected him often, because his land agent had been filing estimates as actuals for what appeared to be the better part of 18 months. He did not argue for the sake of arguing. He went quiet. His deep blue eyes narrowed. That left eyebrow, the one that sat a fraction higher than the right, climbed another degree. And then he asked a question that proved he had understood not just what she said, but why it mattered. This, Eleanor reflected, was rarer than any title. Rarer than 30,000 a year. Rarer, certainly, than a brass pocket compass and a good pair of Hessian boots. She did not say this aloud. She wrote the drainage figure in her ledger and moved on. Their disagreements sharpened into something almost pleasurable. Adrian would begin a sentence about projected yields, with the rolling confidence of a man accustomed to boardrooms and parliamentary committees. And then Eleanor would say 4 words, quiet and precise as a closing argument, and the sentence would stumble. His voice would catch. He would pause, reorganize, try again from a different angle, and sometimes, not always, but sometimes, arrive at something better than what he had started with. She noticed he held his brass compass when he was thinking, turning it slowly between his thumb and forefinger, the case catching the candlelight. He noticed she held her pen like someone trained in a counting house, the grip low, the angle steep, the hand moving with the efficiency of a woman who had written 10,000 entries and could not afford to waste ink on flourish. Neither mentioned what they noticed. Then came the morning of the lime. A tradesman named Burridge, red-faced, barrel-chested, the sort of man who believed volume was a substitute for evidence, arrived at the kitchen door of Ashford Park, demanding payment of an invoice for £4 7 for quicklime delivered to the east boundary. Eleanor met him in the stone-flagged passage, with her ledger under her arm and her cream fichu tucked precisely into the bodice of her dove-grey dress. She produced the original receipt. She quoted the contract clause. Paragraph 6, subsection 2, the agreed rate of 10 pence per bushel for 40 bushels, not the 14 pence he had written on his bill. She calculated the correct total in her head, stated it, and offered him payment on the spot for the accurate amount. The entire exchange lasted 6 minutes. Adrian watched from the doorway. He had come down for coffee. He was still holding the cup. His expression changed. Not dramatically. Adrian was not a man given to dramatic expressions. But something behind those heavy-lidded eyes shifted. Some wall he had built between what he expected of her and what she was. He set the cup down on the hall table without looking at it, and stood very still as Burridge pocketed his corrected payment and left without another word. She walked past him with the ledger under her arm. She smelled of ink and tallow. He said nothing. There was nothing adequate to say. That evening they walked the gravel path that traced the proposed canal route along the southern boundary. The air was sharp with the smell of turned earth and wet leaves. Adrian's boots crunched the gravel in the measured stride of a man who had once walked parade grounds. After 7 minutes of silence, Eleanor counted, he said, without looking at her, that he could not make his drainage figures balance, that he had been over the 7th column 4 times, that something was transposed and he could not find it. Eleanor held out her hand. He gave her the notebook. She opened it, ran her finger down the 7th column, found the transposed figure. A 9 written where a 6 should have been, the error cascading through every subsequent calculation, and handed the notebook back. 3 minutes. No comment. Their fingers brush over the notebook on the gravel path. Neither mentions it. A distant clock strikes 9, and the sound hangs in the autumn air between them, like a question neither is willing to ask. Geoffrey Ashford returned to his own estate on a Tuesday morning, breezy and brown from the Scottish sun, with a brace of grouse and absolutely no idea what had been happening in his morning room. He came through the front door the way he always did, coat half unbuttoned, that green wool riding coat with the mud still on the cuffs from whatever Highland adventure he'd been having, his silver hip flask patting against his chest as he walked. The dimple in his left cheek was out in full force. He was 20 years old, cheerful as a golden retriever, and about as financially literate as one. Adrian was already seated at the table when Geoffrey ambled in. The Marquess of Dunmore had arrived early, his brass pocket compass turning slowly between his fingers, his cravat tied with the kind of precision that suggested a man who had rehearsed his composure. The canal agreement lay on the table between them. 12 pages of terms that gave Dunmore controlling interest in the waterway, 60% of future toll revenues, and the right to sublease Ashford land for the towpath at a rate so laughably below market value it practically constituted theft. Geoffrey read none of it. He picked up the first page, squinted at it the way a man squints at a menu in a language he doesn't speak, and said, "This all looks perfectly reasonable." Of course it did. Everything looks reasonable when you haven't read it. Adrian leaned forward slightly, one hand resting on the table edge, and began explaining the terms in that confident baritone, the voice of a man who had never been interrupted by someone whose opinion mattered. He spoke about infrastructure costs, parliamentary survey fees, projected revenues of £11,000 per annum, numbers designed to impress rather than inform. Geoffrey nodded along, his hazel eyes wide and trusting, already reaching for the pen. And then Eleanor walked in. She didn't knock. She didn't announce herself. She simply appeared in the doorway of the morning room, with that dark brown leather-bound ledger pressed against her ribs, the brass corners catching the light from the window behind her, her grey-green eyes steady as a surgeon's hands. The dove-grey muslin of her dress was plain. The cameo brooch at her collar was small. The loose strands of chestnut hair near her temples moved faintly in the draught from the hall. Nothing about her was loud. Everything about her was precise. "Before you sign," she said, and her voice was the quietest sound in the room, and somehow the only one that mattered. "You should know that Lord Dunmore's northern estates are leveraged against 3 separate creditors, that his quarterly interest payments have been in arrears since March, and that the canal project is not an investment. It is a rescue." She opened the ledger. She laid it on the table beside the unsigned agreement. And then, without malice, without triumph, without raising her voice above the level of someone discussing the weather, she dismantled him. The creditor letters. She had the amounts. £4,200 to Coutts, another £1,800 to a private lender in Edinburgh, a third obligation of £900 secured against timber rights he'd already sold. The accelerated debt schedule. She'd reconstructed it from public filings and 2 conversations with a clerk in Chancery Lane who owed Mr. Pruitt a favour. The leveraged properties. She named them. All 3, including the one where his mother lived. Geoffrey's mouth hung slightly open. Adrian's compass had gone still in his fingers. The counterterms she proposed were written on a separate sheet, tucked inside the ledger like a pressed leaf. Equal partnership. Shared profits split at 50%. A formal clause, and here her voice gained an edge, so fine you could have shaved with it, naming Lady Eleanor Ashford as the Ashford Estate's financial representative in all matters pertaining to the canal venture. She set the sheet down and stepped back. Hands folded, spine straight. The freckles across the bridge of her nose like punctuation marks on a face that had already finished its sentence. Adrian did not shout. That would have been easier. Instead, his deep blue eyes went dark and flat, and his jaw tightened until the beauty mark on his neck disappeared into the tension of his collar. And he said, very quietly, "You knew. For weeks. You sat across from me at dinner and walked beside me on the gravel path, and you knew every word I said was built on sand. And you said nothing. Not fury at the exposure, fury at the silence." She had let him perform authority he did not possess, while she held the power to dismantle him. And she had held it the way a woman holds a card she knows she'll need. Patiently, without flinching, without guilt. "You deceived me," he said, and his voice cracked on the second word in a way that cost him something. Eleanor looked at him, directly, the way she always looked at things, without flinching, without apology, without the small, feminine softness that men of his rank had been trained to expect. "I learned silence," she said, "from watching men mistake it for ignorance. And you, Lord Dunmore, taught me precisely how useful that mistake could be." It landed like a door closing. Not slammed, just shut, with the quiet click of a latch finding its place. This was not about one canal deal. This was the pattern of her entire life made visible in a single exchange. Every room she'd managed without credit. Every ledger she'd balanced without thanks. Every conversation where a man had looked through her towards someone less competent, but more conveniently male. Adrian stood. The compass went into his waistcoat pocket. The agreement stayed unsigned on the table beside the ledger, and the ring he had never given her, and never would. He left without another word. Geoffrey, blinking, his curly light brown hair falling over his forehead, said, "What just happened?" "Go to bed, Geoffrey." He went. Adrian Hale leaves Ashford Hall that night, his carriage wheels crunching on the gravel drive, and Eleanor stands at the morning room window, holding the closed ledger to her chest, watching the lantern light disappear into the dark. 3 days later, Adrian's London solicitor contacted Eleanor directly, and the letter that arrived was not an apology. It was an admission, dressed in legal language, that Dunmore's creditors had accelerated their demands, and the northern estate, the one where his mother lived, would be forfeit within 60 days. 60 days. The letter spelled it out in the clipped, bloodless prose that solicitors use when they want to sound impartial while delivering a death sentence. £3,200 per annum in rents, gone. The house where the Dowager Marchioness had lived for 30 years, gone. The tenants, 14 families, 80-odd souls who paid their rents on quarter day and expected their landlord to keep the roof from leaking, gone. Absorbed into whatever creditor's portfolio swallowed the deed. And at the bottom, in a hand that was clearly not the solicitor's, a single line added in dark ink. Lady Ashford's expertise in estate reconciliation would be of considerable value in this matter. Not help. Not assistance. Expertise. It was the first honest word Adrian Hale had used about her, and he couldn't even write it to her face. Eleanor read the letter twice at the morning room desk, the brass-cornered ledger sitting closed beside her elbow. She folded the paper along its original creases, set it down, and asked the groom to saddle her mare. She rode to Dunmore Park unannounced. No card sent ahead, no note carried by a footman, no polite fiction of a social call. She arrived at 2:30 in the afternoon, her dove-grey muslin flecked with road dust, the cameo brooch at her collar catching the thin October light. And she walked past the butler before he could finish announcing her. She found Adrian in his study, and the study told her everything. Papers covered the desk in drifts, not the orderly stacks of a man working through a problem, but the scattered, overlapping chaos of a man drowning in one. Rent rolls lay open beside bank correspondence. A letter from a creditor in Leeds sat half-crumpled near the inkwell. Columns of figures marched down a sheet of foolscap in Adrian's own hand, and even from the doorway, Eleanor could see that the subtotals did not match the sums above them. He had carried a 7 where there was no 7 to carry. He had transposed 2 digits in a quarterly figure and built 3 subsequent calculations on the error. The accumulated mess of a man who had inherited wealth the way one inherits eye colour, without effort, without understanding, and with the serene assumption that it would simply continue. Adrian sat in the middle of it, his dark gold hair pushed back from his forehead where he'd run his hands through it, the brass compass sitting on the desk beside him like a talisman that had stopped working. His cravat was loosened, his coat was off. The deep blue eyes that had looked at her with such casual authority a week ago now held something she had never seen in them before. He looked lost. Eleanor sat down across from him without invitation. She set the ledger on the desk, the worn brown leather, the brass corners, the spine that had held 4 years of her careful, uncredited, supposedly amateur work, and she opened it to a blank page. "Show me everything," she said. "Not what you wish were true. Everything." 5 words. Each one landed like a stone dropped into still water. And here is the part that mattered. Here is where Adrian Hale, Marquess of Dunmore, did the hardest thing he had ever done in 29 years of a life designed to be easy. He showed her. Not gracefully, not all at once. He started with the Leeds creditor, £400 outstanding, secured against timber rights he'd already sold. Then the mortgage on the northern estate, which his own steward had refinanced at 11% without telling him. Then the canal shares he'd purchased on margin 18 months ago, which had lost 1/3 of their value. Then the rents he'd been collecting at rates set in 1794, because no one had ever told him, or he had never asked, that costs had doubled since. Each admission cost him something. You could see it in his posture, the way his military straight shoulders drew inward by degrees, the way his sentences, those confident, unhurried sentences that had once dismissed her ledger as charmingly thorough, began to falter and stop and start again. The left eyebrow, the one that sat a fraction higher than the right, no longer looked imperious. It looked uncertain. Eleanor did not comfort him. She did not soften. She took each figure he gave her, entered it in the ledger in her neat, small hand, cross-referenced it against the documents on his desk, and corrected him when he was wrong, which was often. They worked through the night. Candles were lit at 6, replaced at 10, replaced again at 1 in the morning. The study filled with the smell of tallow and ink and cold tea that neither of them drank. Outside, an October wind pressed against the windows. Inside, Eleanor restructured 4 years of mismanaged debt with the quiet, relentless precision of a woman who had been doing exactly this, for no pay, no title, no recognition, since she was 19. She found £1,400 in misallocated funds that Pruitt himself had overlooked. Rents assigned to the wrong ledger lines. Timber revenues counted twice. A quarterly payment to a creditor who had been fully satisfied 9 months prior and had simply kept collecting because no one checked. By 4 in the morning, the desk was clear. The ledger lay open between them, Eleanor's handwriting filling the margins of his accounts, her figures correcting his, her notations turning chaos into something a man could act on. The brass corners caught the first grey light through the window. Near dawn, in the grey light that makes liars of everyone, Adrian tells her that her ledgers were never amateur, that he knew it within 3 days, and that his dismissal was the act of a man afraid of how thoroughly she outmatched him. Eleanor says nothing for a long moment. Then she presses her forehead briefly to his shoulder. 3 seconds, no more, and pulls away. The Canal Partnership was signed on a Thursday in the Ashford morning room, on Eleanor's terms, in ink that was, if one looked closely, the same shade she had used in her ledger for 4 years. The document itself ran to 11 pages. Equal shares. Shared profits at a ratio of 50-50 after the initial £40,000 investment was recovered, with quarterly audits conducted by a jointly appointed clerk. And there, in Clause 7, Line 4, in Eleanor's own hand, because she had drafted the final version herself at 2:30 in the morning, while the candle guttered and the house slept around her. Her name. Not Geoffrey's. Not the Ashford estate representative. Eleanor Charlotte Ashford, named as financial agent, signatory, and co-administrator of the Ashford-Dunmore Canal venture, with full authority to approve or deny expenditures exceeding £12. Adrian signed without negotiation. Not a single amendment. Not a clarifying question. Not even the polite fiction of reading it through one more time for form's sake. He took the pen she offered, her pen, from her writing desk, the nib she had sharpened herself that morning, and he signed his name beneath hers on every page that required it. 7 signatures, his hand steady, his deep blue eyes never once flickering toward the door, or the window, or anywhere that suggested he wished to be elsewhere. The document sat beside the brass-cornered ledger on the morning room desk, and for a moment neither of them spoke. Then Adrian set the pen down. He did not stand. He did not reach for her hand. He looked at the ledger, that ordinary, worn, slightly ink-stained ledger that had survived 4 years of thankless work, that had been dismissed as amateur by a man who hadn't bothered to read past the first column, that had crossed a rain-soaked gravel path at dawn and changed the terms of a £40,000 investment. And he said, very quietly, that he had a question unrelated to canals. Eleanor's grey-green eyes lifted from the contract. The loose strands of dark chestnut near her temples caught the morning light. She waited. He asked her to marry him. Not grandly, not publicly, not on one knee in a ballroom with 400 witnesses and a string quartet playing something aspirational in the background. He asked her in the morning room, beside her writing desk, with ink still drying on the contract and the smell of tallow and paper and old wood around them both. He asked her the way one asks a partner, in a venture that matters more than pride, plainly, without ornament, with the full understanding that she might say no, and that her no would be final, and that he would deserve it. His sentence started confident and faltered somewhere around the word if. The left eyebrow, the one that always sat a fraction higher than the right, did something complicated. His hand found the small brass compass in his waistcoat pocket and turned it once, twice, then stopped. Eleanor did not answer immediately. She looked at the ledger. She looked at the contract. She looked at the man sitting across from her who had, 9 days ago, called her work charmingly amateur, with the careless ease of someone who had never once been ignored in a room he entered. She looked at the same man who had, 3 hours ago, pressed his forehead to the edge of a desk and admitted she had outmatched him. And she told him her condition. Her name on every ledger, every contract, every document the partnership produced, not as a courtesy, not as a decorative flourish beneath his, as a legal fact, witnessed and recorded, binding in perpetuity. Adrian agreed without hesitation. And here was the difference, the only difference that mattered. The difference between this moment and his courtesy at the beginning of their acquaintance. He meant it, not because it cost him nothing, but because it cost him the last comfortable assumption he had carried about whose name belonged at the top of a page. He meant it the way a man means something when he has watched a woman work and understood, finally, that competence is not a quality to be admired from a safe distance. It is a quality to be partnered with, respected, built beside. Eleanor said yes. One word, landed like a closing argument. A cough sounded from the doorway. Mr. Pruitt stood there, silver-white hair combed neatly back, bushy eyebrows curling upward at the outer edges, the brass ring of estate keys hanging from the leather fob at his belt. His pale blue eyes were sharp and entirely unsurprised. The cough was, as always, diplomatic. Behind him, Geoffrey ambled into view. Green riding coat carelessly buttoned, light brown curls falling over his forehead, the silver hip flask making a faint outline in his coat pocket. His hazel eyes were wide and cheerful and slightly baffled, which was, to be fair, their natural state. He looked from his sister to Adrian, to the signed contract, to the ledger, and back to his sister, and he asked, with the honest bewilderment of a young man who had spent 20 years watching someone else manage his life, whether this meant someone else would finally handle the accounts. Eleanor and Adrian answered simultaneously. "I will." Mr. Pruitt's cough deepened. Geoffrey's dimple appeared. The morning room, the same morning room where Eleanor had sat alone for 4 years, adding columns no one read, balancing books no one checked, keeping an estate solvent through competence and stubbornness, and a brass-cornered ledger that never lied, held all 4 of them in a square of Thursday sunlight, and for the first time in longer than anyone present cared to calculate, the chair opposite Eleanor's writing desk was not empty. The church clock strikes noon. The ledger lies open on the desk between them, and it is no longer a record of what was owed or what was lost. It is the first page of what comes next, and Eleanor Ashford's name is written at the top of every one.